This $1 ugly-looking square of cotton. It measures exactly 22 inches by 22 inches. It has a paisley print, those little teardrop shapes you see on old ties or tablecloths. You can buy one right now at a gas station for 99 cents. You can use it to wipe sweat off your forehead. You can use it to keep dust out of your nose. In a farmhouse in Nebraska, it is just a handkerchief. But in Los Angeles, in the spring of 1992, this piece of cloth was not an accessory. It was a death sentence. If you wore the red one on the wrong street corner in South Central, you didn't just get a dirty look, you got a bullet. If you wore the blue one in the wrong housing project in Compton, you didn't make it home to dinner. How is that possible? How did a $1 piece of fabric, made in a factory in China, become the most dangerous object in the United States? How did a simple color choice turn the City of Angels into a war zone that looked like Beirut? To understand that, you have to go back to the months before the city burned. You have to step into the heat, the smog, and the paranoia of Los Angeles in 1992. Imagine you're driving a beige Honda Civic down Florence Avenue. It's a hot afternoon. That dry, dusty California heat that bakes the asphalt. You have the window down. Maybe you have your left arm resting on the door frame. You aren't a soldier. You aren't a criminal. You are just a guy trying to get to a job interview. But you made one mistake. You decided to wear a red baseball cap today. Or maybe you have a blue rag wiping the dashboard. You stop at a red light. You feel eyes on you. You look to your left, and you see a car full of teenagers. They aren't looking at your face. They are staring at that splash of color on your dashboard. And in that split second, your heart stops. Because you know the rules. You know that in 1992, there are no civilians. There are only colors. This was the terrifying reality of life in LA. The city had been carved up into invisible territories, marked not by fences or walls, but by graffiti and bandanas. The rag, the flag, the bandana. It was the uniform of a civil war that was happening right under the noses of the Hollywood elite. While the rest of America was watching The Cosby Show and listening to Nirvana, Los Angeles was quietly bleeding out. But why the bandana? Why not a tattoo? Why not a badge? Because the bandana was the perfect tool for an urban guerrilla war. It was cheap, it was disposable, and most importantly, it was hidden in plain sight. You could keep it in your back pocket, flagging it for everyone to see when you felt safe. But the second you saw a police cruiser, those black and white Chevy Caprices that prowled the neighborhoods like sharks, you could tuck it away. In 1 second, you went from being a soldier in the Crips or the Bloods to just another kid on the street. It drove the LAPD insane. And that is where the real fear comes in, because this story isn't just about gang members fighting each other. If it was just that, maybe the city wouldn't have exploded the way it did. The real terror started when the police decided that the bandana was enough reason to suspend the Constitution. Daryl Gates, the police chief at the time, was a man who believed in force. He didn't want to police the neighborhoods. He wanted to conquer them. His officers were looking for these flags. And if you were a young man in 1992, and you had a blue bandana hanging out of your pocket, you were fair game. They called it Operation Hammer. And it felt exactly like it sounds. On a Friday night, the police would sweep through a neighborhood, arresting hundreds of people. They weren't looking for murderers. They were looking for anyone who looked like a problem. And the number one indicator? That 99-cent piece of cotton. So now you have a city where the criminals will kill you for wearing the wrong color, and the police will arrest you for wearing the right one. You are trapped. The pressure is building. The air is getting thicker. Everyone knew something was coming. You could feel it in the grocery stores. You could feel it at the gas pumps. People were angry. They were tired. They were scared. But nobody, not the police, not the politicians, not even the gang leaders, knew just how bad it was going to get. Because while the gangs were fighting over red and blue, a jury in Simi Valley was looking at a videotape that was black and white. A videotape of a man named Rodney King being beaten by police officers. The city was a powder keg. The bandana was the fuse. And on April 29th, 1992, someone was about to light the match. But here is the question that haunts everyone who lived through it. When the riot started, when the fires began to consume the city, what happened to the colors? Did the red and blue armies keep fighting? Or did they realize they had a common enemy? The answer is one of the strangest, most dangerous moments in American history. And it started with a truce that no one saw coming. 3:15 p.m., Wednesday, April 29th, 1992. You are sitting in your living room. Maybe you have the news on while you fold laundry. The anchor comes on the screen. He looks pale. He reads the verdict from the courthouse in Simi Valley regarding the 4 officers who beat Rodney King. Not guilty? Not guilty? Not guilty? For a few seconds, there is silence. The kind of silence that comes before a tornado touches down. And then the phone lines in Los Angeles light up. But here's the thing that history books often leave out. While the rest of the country was watching the news in shock, something impossible was happening in the housing projects of Watts. Just days before the verdict, the unthinkable had happened. The leaders of the Bloods and the Crips, armies that had been killing each other over colors for 20 years, met in a gym. They didn't bring guns. They brought the bandanas. They took a red rag and a blue rag, and they tied them together. They called it the Watts Truce. They declared that the war between the colors was over. They were united against a common enemy, the police department that had been hunting them down. To the average citizen, this sounds like good news, right? Peace in the streets? Wrong. To the LAPD, this was a nightmare scenario. A divided gang is a nuisance. A united gang is an army. The police suddenly realized they were outnumbered. The thin blue line was looking very, very thin. And then, the sun started to go down on Florence Avenue. It started with a single arrest. Police tried to detain a young man. A crowd gathered. They were angry about the verdict. They started yelling. Then came a bottle, then a rock. And this is the moment where the story turns from a protest into a horror movie. The police commander on the scene looked at the angry crowd. He looked at his officers. And he gave an order that changed everything. Retreat. You heard that right. The police got in their cars and drove away. They left the intersection of Florence and Normandy completely unguarded. Imagine watching that from your window. The people who are paid to protect you just left. The traffic lights are still changing red to green, but the laws of society have just been canceled. And into that vacuum stepped the men with the bandanas. But they weren't wearing them in their back pockets anymore. They weren't hiding them. They took those 99-cent squares of cotton and tied them around their faces. The bandana transformed. It wasn't a flag anymore. It was a mask. It was anonymity. Suddenly, you couldn't tell who was a neighbor and who was a killer. The intersection became a kill zone. And then, a white gravel truck turned the corner. The driver was a man named Reginald Denny. He didn't have a radio. He didn't know the verdict. He didn't know the police had fled. He was just a guy doing his job, driving a shortcut to save time. Millions of Americans watched what happened next live on television from a news helicopter hovering overhead. They watched the truck get stopped. They watched men with bandanas over their faces pull Denny out of the cab. They watched a brick hit his skull. It was the most terrifying reality TV show in history. But the scariest part wasn't the violence. The scariest part was what wasn't there. There were no sirens. There were no flashing lights. The helicopter pilot was screaming over the radio, "Where are the police? Where are the police?" But they weren't coming. The message went out across the city instantly. You are on your own. If you were a shopkeeper, you were on your own. If you were driving home from work, you were on your own. The social contract had been shredded. The only thing that mattered was what you had in your hands and who was standing next to you. As night fell, The first plumes of smoke started to rise. Liquor stores, gas stations, furniture shops. The fire department tried to respond, but they were shot at. So they stopped coming too. Now imagine the sun is down. The streetlights are shot out. The only light comes from the burning buildings reflecting off the clouds. The air smells like burning rubber and gasoline. And in the shadows, you see them. Groups of young men moving through the smoke, some wearing red, some wearing blue, moving together. The police had feared the bandanas for years. They had arrested kids for carrying them. They had treated them like contraband. But on the night of April 29th, the bandana wasn't the problem. The problem was that the city had run out of people to stop them. Los Angeles was burning. The police were hiding. And the citizens realized that help was not coming. But as the fires spread toward the rich neighborhoods, toward Koreatown and Hollywood, something else began to happen. The people realized that if the police wouldn't save them, they would have to save themselves. And in the smoky dawn of the second day, a new sound began to echo through the streets. It wasn't the sound of sirens. It was the sound of loading chambers. The shopkeepers were climbing onto the roofs. And they weren't holding bandanas. They were holding rifles. Thursday morning, April 30th, 1992. The sun came up, but you couldn't really see it. The sky over Los Angeles was a bruised purple and black. The smoke was so thick that pilots landing at LAX 20 miles away had to use instrument navigation. Ash was falling on the swimming pools in Beverly Hills like gray snow. If you were waking up in the city that morning, you reached for the phone. You dialed 911, and for the first time in your life, nobody answered. The circuits were jammed. The system was dead. This is the moment the fear truly set in. On day one, people thought it was a riot. By day two, they realized it was a siege. The violence wasn't staying in South Central anymore. It was moving north. It was moving west. It was spreading like a virus. The invisible lines that divided the gangs, the lines marked by those red and blue bandanas, were gone. The whole city was territory now. And the police? They were still effectively paralyzed. They were protecting their own stations, forming perimeters around their headquarters, leaving the miles of streets between them completely open. This created a power vacuum. And nature hates a vacuum. If the police weren't going to hold the line, someone else had to. Enter the shopkeepers of Koreatown. These were immigrants who had spent their life savings to open grocery stores, electronics shops, and swap meets. They had watched the news the night before. They saw the police run away. They knew that if the mob came for their stores, they were the only defense left, so they didn't call the cops. They called each other. They tuned their radios to Korean language stations that were broadcasting SOS messages. Looters at Western and 3rd. Fire at Vermont and 8th. And then Americans saw an image on their TV screens that they had never seen before. Men in polo shirts and slacks, standing on the roofs of supermarkets. They weren't holding protest signs. They were holding hunting rifles, shotguns, and semi-automatic pistols. They were firing warning shots into the air. And when the warning shots didn't work, they fired into the street. It looked like a scene from a militia movie, but it was happening at the local mini-mall. The bandana boys were down on the pavement, looting VCRs and sneakers. The shopkeepers were up on the roof, fighting for their livelihoods. It was a vertical war, and in the middle of this chaos, the simple bandana had become the only form of ID that mattered. If you were driving through a neighborhood, the color of the rag in your window determined if you were a friend or a target. Reporters were taping handwritten signs to their cars that said, "TV crew, don't shoot." People were taping white towels to their antennas, the universal sign of surrender, just to drive to the grocery store to buy milk. The bandana had started as a gang symbol. Now it was the flag of a city that had lost its mind. The rumors started flying. And in a panic, rumors are more dangerous than bullets. People whispered that the gangs were cutting power lines. They whispered that they were poisoning the water supply. They whispered that the Bloods and Crips were marching toward the wealthy suburbs of Bel Air and Brentwood. Was it true? It didn't matter. The fear was true. Gun stores across California sold out of ammunition in hours. People who had never held a weapon in their lives were sleeping with baseball bats and kitchen knives under their pillows. By Thursday afternoon, the mayor of Los Angeles, Tom Bradley, went on television. He looked exhausted. He declared a dusk-to-dawn curfew. Think about that. In one of the freest cities in the world, it was now a crime to be outside after sunset. But the curfew was a joke. You can't tell a fire to stop burning. You can't tell a mob to go home when they know there are no consequences. As the sun went down on the second day, the fires were bigger. The looting was organized. People were pulling up in vans and clearing out entire appliance stores in assembly lines. The LAPD was broken. The fire department was overwhelmed. The local government had lost control. The city was teetering on the edge of something we hadn't seen since the Civil War. Total insurrection. There was only one card left to play. The one card you never want to play in a democracy. The phone rang in the Oval Office. The governor of California was on the line. He wasn't asking for money. He wasn't asking for prayers. He was asking for the army. The order was signed. The engine started up. And thousands of miles away, young men in camouflage were loading magazines with live ammunition. They weren't deploying to Iraq. They were deploying to Wilshire Boulevard. The boots were about to hit the ground. And the city was about to find out what happens when the military meets the street. Friday, May 1st, 1992, the third day. If you looked out your window that morning, you saw something that didn't belong in America. You saw Humvees rolling down Sunset Boulevard. You saw 7-ton cargo trucks parked in front of burnt-out strip malls. The cavalry had arrived, but they weren't wearing police blues. They were wearing desert camouflage. President George H.W. Bush had invoked the Insurrection Act. It's a piece of paper that gives the president the power to use military troops against American citizens to restore order. It is the nuclear option of domestic policy. Suddenly, the streets of Los Angeles looked like a scene from Operation Desert Storm. 4,000 federal troops, 10,000 National Guardsmen. Marines from Camp Pendleton were digging foxholes in the lawns of public libraries. Soldiers were directing traffic at intersections where the lights had melted. The dynamic on the street changed instantly. For 48 hours, the guys with the bandanas had run the city. They had the numbers. They had the fear. But a Glock 9mm doesn't argue with an armored personnel carrier. The looting stopped. The fires burned out. The curfew was enforced at the barrel of an M16. The party was over. As the smoke finally cleared on Saturday and Sunday, the city woke up with a massive hangover. The numbers were staggering. 63 people were dead. Over 2,000 were injured. 12,000 people had been arrested. $1 billion in property damage. Entire city blocks had been erased from the map. It looked like the Luftwaffe had bombed South Central. But in the ashes of the riots, something strange happened to the bandana. Remember that Watts truce? The moment when the red and the blue tied their flags together? It actually held. For a little while. In the months after the riots, gang homicides in Los Angeles actually dropped. The unity that was forged in the fire kept the peace better than the police ever could. The bandana briefly became a symbol of solidarity, a sign that the neighborhoods were tired of killing each other. But tragedy rarely has a happy ending. The truce eventually fractured. The old rivalries crept back in. The colors separated again. However, the image of that bandana had changed forever. It had escaped Los Angeles. Because the whole world was watching those 3 days in April, the bandana became global. It became the symbol of American rebellion. Suddenly, you saw it in music videos on MTV. You saw rappers like Tupac Shakur wearing the bandana tied forward, rabbit ears style. You saw it in fashion magazines in Paris and Tokyo. The object that had been a death sentence on Florence Avenue was now being sold in suburban malls in Ohio. Kids who had never been within 1,000 miles of Compton were wearing blue paisley bandanas to school because it looked tough. They didn't know the code. They didn't know the history. They didn't know that people had died for that piece of cloth. Today, 30 years later, you can still buy that bandana at the gas station. It's still 99 cents. It's still just a square of printed cotton. But if you talk to the people who were there, the shopkeepers who stood on the roofs, the drivers who were pulled from their trucks, the mothers who hid their children in the bathtubs while the city burned, they see it differently. When they see that paisley print, they don't see a fashion statement. They see the smoke. They hear the glass breaking. They feel the heat of a city that tore itself apart from the inside out. It is a reminder of how fragile our society really is. We think we are safe. We think the laws protect us. But in 1992, Los Angeles learned the hard way that civilization is just a thin layer of ice, and all it takes is one verdict, one spark, and one piece of colored cloth to shatter it completely. The bandana is just an object. It has no power on its own. It only has the meaning we give it. And for 3 days in 1992, we gave it the power to burn down a city. I'm Host Name, and this has been American Lore. If you remember watching the smoke rise over LA, or if you just want to understand the history of the things we take for granted, please click that subscribe button. It helps us keep these stories alive. Stay safe, watch your back, and I'll see you in the next one.